Okay, so tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Carol Blanchette, who will be talking about marine protected areas. Carol is an associate research biologist at the Marine Science Institute at the University California, Santa Barbara. She has conducted extensive research on coastal ecosystems and related conservation policy issues. So please help me welcome Carol Blanchette.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? I feel like I'm in mission control with this headset on, so it's just going to take me a little while to get used to this. And I just want to say, too, I like to be relatively informal in speaking, so please, if you have a question, don't hesitate to, you know, hold off and potentially forget it by the end. Just hold up your hand, and we'll try to talk as we go along. But I'm really happy to see so many people out here on this foggy night, especially these young people. And it's really inspiring to me to see so many people here that are interested in hearing more about our coastal ocean and what's happening out there. So I wanted to talk generally about marine protected areas along the coast of California, and I know many of you here are very interested in the Channel Islands because we're so close to the islands. But there's also a very large statewide process going on with marine protected areas. And so what I thought I would try to do is give you a bit of a background of the entire picture of marine protected areas across the state. And I'm someone who works in this field of marine protected areas, and I find many of the different policies and designations a little bit bewildering. And so I'm sure that people outside of the area of marine protected areas must have a similar confusion sometimes, trying to sort through all the different acronyms and the different rules and regulations and policies. So what I'd like to do is sort of give a little bit of a history, an overview that, and then talk a little bit more about some of the monitoring that's happening, and then focus in towards the end more specifically on the Channel Islands here and what's happening in our backyard. So as we all know, there are areas of special protection that are near and dear to many of our hearts on land, so places like Yosemite, places that are national parks and wilderness areas. And we're very familiar with these kinds of places on land, but not so many people are familiar with the concept of a wilderness or a protected area in the ocean. And that's because protected areas are relatively rare in the ocean. So if we think about the entire globe and we think about all of the different places on land that are protected, that adds up to about 10 to 15% of the total land surface area. If we look at the ocean, and this is very recent since we've added all these protected areas, we're barely to 1% of the entire area of the ocean. So relative to land, protected in the areas of the ocean are relatively a recent phenomenon. Okay, and we all have seen these headlines of sort of gloom and doom that there are a lot of problems in the ocean right now, and those problems range from overfishing to climate change related issues such as coral reef bleaching, ocean acidification, marine debris is an increasingly large problem, pollution. So the oceans are really having a difficult time right now. And so there have been a variety of ways people have been thinking about to figure out how we can address some of these issues. Some of the issues about climate change we may not be able to prevent, but there are some things that we can do something about, and overfishing is certainly one of those. So here's just a global map that was created by a group at NCEAS led by Ben Halpern that depicts different areas of the globe. And what they did was they tried to determine the amount of impact to different places in the ocean globally. And those impacts ranged from pollution, overfishing, and all those sorts of things. And cumulatively, what they did then was give different areas of the ocean these scores depicted by color. So you can see that the most impacted areas of the ocean tended to be these areas where there are a lot of humans, places that are coastal, places where there's a lot of fishing, and places where the human footprint is relatively large. So this is more of a global picture. We also know that fisheries worldwide are in decline, and this is These are data showing catch of various fishes throughout the world, and the time scale ranges from about 1960 or 1970 all the way up to the present time. And in almost every single case, these fisheries are suffering quite badly. And if we even look locally at our rockfish fisheries along the west coast, we see the same sort of picture. So this is sort of some of the motivation behind the conservation measures that are taking place now. Another sort of concept I want to bring across is this idea of shifting baselines. So if you talk to people, maybe they're your grandparents or your parents even, back when they were fishing, maybe fish look like this. And then, when some of us that are my age and a little bit older were growing up, maybe they looked like that. And, maybe last week they look like this. So this idea of shifting baselines is that what we see now becomes the new normal. And again, this could depict that scenario that a diver in the Channel Islands might have seen underwater in 1960 and sort of what it looks like today. And so if you're a young person, this might be your normal. But it may not be the historic picture of what has been there over time. And so the idea is what we would like to do is restore these ecosystems back to the place where they were before humans were having such a large impact, before these fisheries were all in decline. And one of the tools of conservation to do that are marine protected areas. Now, marine protected areas are very simply just places in the ocean that are protected in some way. It doesn't necessarily even have to be from fishing. The Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary is an excellent example of that. The Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary does not regulate fishing per se, but it is a protected area, and it's protected from oil and gas sorts of activities. Marine protected areas can also protect against overfishing by regulating the amount of fishing that happens in those areas. And so worldwide, these have been used as a tool for conservation. It's not a new thing at all. And some of the best studies about how marine protected areas work are from other parts of the world. So Europe, there's a great number of marine protected areas in Europe, and then certainly along the Great Barrier Reef in Australia and the Caribbean. So here's kind of a roadmap for what I think I'd like to talk a little bit about today is what are marine protected areas, just so that we're all on the same page, why we need them. And then I'd like to move into talking a little bit about the process that's happening right now in the state of California, and that is under a piece of legislation called the Marine Life Protection Act, which I will explain in a little bit more detail. And I'd like to talk about how the Marine Life Protection Act has led to the design of new networks of marine protected areas, and then the kinds of monitoring that's happening in those protected areas now that's going to give us an insight as to what's going on and how well they're working, and then focus on a few case studies looking at changes over time in protected areas. And then finally, I'd like to end up just talking a little bit about public involvement. So how can people get access to these kinds of information and these sorts of data? Okay, so starting out really generally, what are marine protected areas? Basically just separate geographic areas designed to protect or conserve marine life and habitat. So places where something is regulated. And these can range from sort of the most restrictive are the state marine reserves. Those tend to be no-take areas. And they may have, this varies a little bit depending on where they are, but it may have possible use restrictions. And then there are also various other designations ranging from state marine parks to state marine conservation areas to state marine recreational management area. And I think this is where some of the confusion that people have sets in about all these different designations. And I guess my advice to people is always to, if you're in doubt, the best source of information is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, now not Fish and Game anymore, website, which actually has really, really nice maps of all of these areas across the state and what's allowed and not allowed. Okay, so the goals, generally speaking, of marine reserves include conserving biodiversity, improving the management of fisheries, and preserving and restoring habitat. Okay, these goals derive from societal wishes to preserve areas for the enjoyment of nature, to maintain the functioning of ecosystems, to establish replenishment zones for overexploited species, and to provide insurance against uncertainty inherent in managing living natural resources. And so I think this is a very good summary of all the kinds of things that marine protected areas try to do. And the sort of analogy I like to think about with marine protected areas are, you know, most of us have some sort of a bank account where we keep our money, and it might be a checking account, a savings account, a mutual fund, you know, the whole gamut of different accounts, but it's just a way to make sure that you have money that is set aside so that in the event something happens, you might need that money. Now, what is the best investment advice any investor would give you would be, well, if you're going to invest, you want to diversify your portfolio. And we'll talk a little bit about that and a little bit about how marine protected areas have strived in the design of networks to provide a diversified portfolio. And that portfolio includes diversification in terms of types of habitats and biogeography. So that's the analogy, I think, that makes the most sense to me in terms of how we think about conserving money, resources, etc. Okay, so public support generally is quite favorable when it comes to marine protected areas, despite the oftentimes controversial things you may read about in the newspaper or hear about on the news. And I think these are just two example questions that were posed to public audiences before this whole process of Marine Life Protection Act and MPA started along the coast of California. And different ways of phrasing the question, you know, how about creating more marine reserves off the California coast, even if this means that some ocean areas will be off limits to commercial and recreational fishing? Do you favor or oppose such an action? Well, most of the people weren't on board with that. And it really didn't matter so much how you ask that question in a slightly different way. You get about 3/4 of the people saying, yeah, I'm on board with that idea. And so this public support really was behind the passage of this piece of legislation called the California Marine Life Protection Act, which was passed into state law in 1999. And this mandates a statewide network of marine protected areas. And I use the term network here, and I'll talk about what I mean by network a little bit later. So the purpose of this act is to protect ecosystems and habitats, and also, I'll talk about this in a little bit too, but reform some of the existing marine protected areas that occurred along the coast of California. And the problem with those areas was that many of them were very small. Many of them had really, really diverse kinds of regulations, and they also didn't extend into deeper waters. So the habitat protection was quite limited. And these are the general goals of the Marine Life Protection Act. So to protect the natural diversity and function of marine ecosystems, to help sustain and restore marine life populations, to improve recreational, educational, and study opportunities in areas with minimal human disturbance, to provide representative and unique marine life habitats, clear objectives, effective management, adequate enforcement, and sound science, and I'll get back to that one in a minute too, and to ensure that they are designed and managed as a network. And when you read these, it's really interesting because so much of the controversy about marine protected areas and whether they're working or not really focuses largely on these socioeconomic issues of fishing and whether or not it's providing an enhancement to fisheries and how much. and how that needs to be changed in order for them to do that better. And while that is one goal, it's really important, I think, to remember that there are a lot of goals here. So it's not necessarily all entirely about fisheries. And then just to give you a sense of the timeline here, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing with the Channel Islands, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but prior to this piece of legislation in 1999, from the period of 1909 to 1913, California actually had 6 very small marine protected areas. By 1950, those were removed, and we had none. So by 1950, there were actually no marine protected areas in California. In the period of 1950 to 1999, that's when all these small idiosyncratic MPAs popped up. There was no network of these MPAs. There was just maybe one here, one there. And none of them extended into the deeper waters. So in 1998, which is the year before the Marine Life Protection Act happened, a group, I can't remember the exact name, I think it's the Channel Islands Marine Resources something group. Someone can help me out if they remember the exact name. But they formed because they were very concerned about protecting the marine life of the Channel Islands. And the process was initiated between the California Department of Fish and Game and the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary to create a system of marine protected areas around the Channel Islands. So that was in 1998. In 1999, the MLPA legislation was passed into law. So actually, Channel Islands was really leading the way in terms of all of the Marine Life Protection Act, in terms of all of MPAs in the state of California. And the good and bad of that was it was leading the way. The bad, it was kind of the guinea pig. And I think, you know, and those of us who've lived in this area have seen how that all played out. But there were, you know, there were mistakes made and there were corrections made, and I think it's all back on track now. But it was very much the first real network of marine protected areas in this state. So then in 1999, this MLPA legislature passed. The ensuing couple of years were a little bit frustrating because what happened was there wasn't really adequate financial support, and there wasn't an adequate social system in place to deal with the controversial issues that arose between stakeholder groups, science, and policymakers. And so I say 2 false starts and process stalls, but basically the whole thing went on hold for a couple of years because no one could get past these hurdles until about 2004, when the Marine Life Protection Act initiative happened. And what that was a privately funded group, the Resources Legacy Foundation, came in and provided the financial support and also provided a structure for the California Fish and Game to work with them, with the stakeholders, and with the scientists. And that became a very successful process. It was funded, which was really important, and that really kicked off the whole process that we see now with marine protected areas along the state. So, yeah, absolutely.
The Channel Islands Marine Protected Areas, the first go-around, actually started in 2013 and went into effect. So they didn't have...
Well, yes, they went into effect.
They weren't part of that false start. They
Right.
started in 2002,
Yep.
and then they got extended in 2007.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and that's why it gets a little bit murky, because although the Channel Islands process was initiated in 1998, they did not become marine protected areas until 2003. And now they have been rolled in to the South Coast region of this MLPA process. So there have been a few changes along the way with the Channel Islands. So this is the Marine Life Protection Act initiative that I just spoke about, and it was really the contribution of this private sort of public partnership, the Resources Legacy Foundation, that really made this a successful initiative and actually led to what we see today in terms of marine protection, marine protected areas. As a result of that, here's where we are today. We now have 5 subregions along the coast of California, and within each of these 5 subregions, there are networks of marine protected areas. And so the first of these subregions was the Central Coast region. Whoops, I'm sorry. And they're just coming up on, I believe, nearly 5 years now of having MPAs in place in that region. The second region was the North Central Coast region here, kind of surrounding San Francisco Bay on the outer coast. The third region, which is our region down here, I'll talk a little bit more about later, the South Coast region, and I mentioned the Channel Islands MPAs have been rolled into that region. And those MPAs were established, the process took place, kind of started out back in 2009, but those MPAs were officially adopted into law and enforced as of January 1st, 2012 in the South Coast region. Right now, the process is just winding up in the North Coast region, which is really unique. I can talk a little bit more about that later, but the unique thing about the North Coast region is there's a large group of individuals, Native American tribes, that are really part of that process in the North Coast that have not been so much a big player in those processes in the other region. And so I think that was something that nobody really thought about very much until that happened up there, but now it's actually turning out to be quite a good relationship between the tribes, the fish and game, and other stakeholders in that region. And then the fifth and the final MPA region is going to be the San Francisco Bay. And those are all the waters inside the San Francisco Bay. And that is going to be the next and the final region to go into effect. So here's just a snapshot of the statewide percentage of the coast as marine protected areas across these regions. If you look at the totals here, we see that approximately 16% of the coast of California is now held as marine protected areas of one sort or another. And this is comprised of 124 separate marine protected areas covering 850 square miles. So 16% of the coast total. Oops. Just a minute on the structure I talked about with the Marine Life Protection Act initiative. What was really successful about that initiative was the social dimension of how it created this stakeholder group which was working with the science advisory team and providing input on different alternative designs for these networks of marine protected areas, and those designs then would be fed into this blue ribbon task force, which would then recommend these alternatives with one preferred alternative, finally to the California Fish and Game Commission, who sort of has the final word to adopt and designate these as MPAs. So what are the general guidelines that came out of this very long process that happened? The first is to ensure that they're big enough. And so this was always a debate between stakeholders and scientists. You know, how big should they be? And we can talk a little bit about this later, but general rules is that they should have a long shore span of at least 5 to 10 kilometers, but preferably 10 to 20 kilometers. Wanted to make sure that they were deep enough. This was a big problem with some of the initial MPAs along the state of California. They didn't really extend into these deeper waters, so that they should extend, the recommendation is extend from the intertidal zone to the deep waters offshore to encompass all these different habitats. And then finally, it's really important that they need to be close enough together to be protecting populations that have dispersal from one population to another, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So what do we know about how MPAs work? Well, we mentioned already, these are some of the main functions that MPAs strive for: habitat conservation, preserving biodiversity, this insurance policy, again, against catastrophe, reproductive reserve, and so that's the sort of bank account analogy. We want to make sure that we have old, fecund fish and invertebrates in these MPAs that are going to reproduce, and then hopefully fishery enhancement. Just to speak a little bit about some of the biology that affects these decisions, many marine organisms, as many of you know, live in different places throughout their life cycle. And what this means is that the adult fishes that you see on a reef, they produce babies, they produce larvae that oftentimes will drift around in the open ocean for a period of time. For some of these species, we have an estimate of how long that is. Other species, we're not really sure. So that if you protect these areas, let's say this reef is an MPA, this reef is an MPA, well, this reef, the adult fish in this reef could be reproducing and their larvae could be going off to another place. Or this MPA could be getting larvae from another place. So this idea of connectivity is really important in thinking about how MPAs might function as a network, because if you're a larva, and no one's going to catch a larva and bring it home and fillet it up for dinner. They're going to catch an adult fish and bring that home. So larvae have very few risks. It's okay to leave an MPA if you're a larva, because yes, you could get eaten for sure, but it's not a fisheries related issue, whereas for an adult fish, leaving the reserve poses some risk. This is the second idea I talked about, which is reproductive reserve. And what we know for many different fish species is some estimates about how many young they are able to reproduce at different sizes. And just thinking about some basic physics of areas and length to volume ratios, even relatively small increases in size. So, you know, a fish that's 14 inches going from a fish that's 23 inches, you know, it may be a doubling in the length, but the number of young that they reproduce is vastly greater. So it's really important in MPAs to protect these larger individuals because they're disproportionately contributing to the reproduction of that reef. One thing we know about how MPAs work from looking at different areas over time that have different levels of protection is that we tend to see shifts in the size distributions of individuals. And these are two examples from rocky intertidal communities that have either high human use, medium human use, or low human use. And the general pattern, which we'll see a little bit later in some of the data I'm going to show you, is that in areas that have a lot of fishing pressure or a lot of high human use, you tend to see very few individuals that are in these larger size classes. Most of the individuals, if this is the size axis, are in these much smaller size classes. As you go from high human use to low human use, or high fishing to low fishing, you tend to see what we say is like the curve filling in. You tend to see more larger individuals. And that's the case in this example here for both these owl limpets as well as for mussels. Okay, one other sort of piece of information relating to how reserves work is that not only do you see more individuals, so density is greater, but the sizes of those individuals tend to be greater in reserves. So biomass or size, density tends to be greater. The sizes of the individuals, not just the biomass, as well as the diversity, so different kinds of species. And so these are data from a meta-analysis where the authors here took many different studies that were done in and out of marine protected areas around the world, and they analyzed the data, and that's what each of these individual points are. These are individual studies. So there's a wide range of variability, but when you look at the averages, that trend tends to emerge time and time again. Here's an example from the Anacapa Island MPA, just out here, of one other thing that we tend to see in some reserves, which is a shift in the structure of the food web. And as many of you know, lobsters are abundant here in the Channel Islands, and those lobsters are predators on sea urchins, and the sea urchins eat kelp. So the simple idea here is that in places where there are lots of lobsters, they're going to eat a lot of the urchins, making the urchins much more scarce. And since the urchins are more scarce, there's potentially going to be more kelp. And indeed, what was shown over time in the Anacapa Marine Reserve is that in the marine protected area, so the area in green here with reserve, there were 6 times more lobster because those lobster obviously were protected from being caught. And because there were more lobster, they were having a lot of predation pressure on the urchins. So there were a lot more urchins, and as a result of more urchins, there was less kelp. And what's really interesting, because this is one of the... More kelp. Yes, sorry, more kelp. You can see it there. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. What's really interesting about this example is that this MPA was one of those that had been in place for a really long period of time. And so because kelp kind of comes and goes in events like El Niños and storms, the kelp really only persisted in the MPA, and it's thought to be due to this trophic effect through the lobsters and the urchins. Can we have too much kelp? Depends what your perspective is. Do you like kelp? I like kelp, so I don't think we can ever have too much kelp. Yeah, I mean, kelp is it's a really important structural element for a lot of different fish species. Yeah, I mean, and certainly it's. Yeah, I'm a fan of kelp, so. I think you can never have too much kelp, personally. And kelp, you know, to me, a kelp or an ecosystem, especially along the coast here, a rocky reef ecosystem with a lot of kelp, signals to me a healthy ecosystem. More kelp, there's lots of studies that look at biodiversity, so more kelp, more biodiversity, so it's something that is what they call an ecosystem engineer. It really forms not only a food source, but a habitat for a lot of different species. Yeah.
I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in 83, a lot of the kelp got wiped out with
the El Nino. Mm-hmm.
And before that, we had a lot more kelp, and would never regain the amount of kelp we had back then.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about El Ninos and kelp, and this is totally a tangent, but because I study kelp, is that every El Nino tends to have a very different footprint depending on when it starts and the conditions it starts under. So in some cases, there are El Ninos that where the nutrients are depleted before the storms hit. Some cases, the storms hit before the nutrients are depleted. But some places, if you lose that kelp in a severe El Nino, it may or may not ever come back again. And there's this idea of alternative stable states or phase shifts that can happen where you can actually transform this system from one thing to another. And so that's a really active area of research, especially out here in the Channel Islands and with the kelp forests, is this, this state transition between kelp forests and urchin barrens. And so there are a variety of different studies that have been done looking at that I could talk about later if you're interested. So indirect effects, so the shift in the food web I just talked about was one form of an indirect effect. This is from one of the oldest marine protected areas in Chile, and in Chile, humans go down in the intertidal areas and they harvest these animals called Concholepis concholepis. They call it the loco, the Chilean abalone. It's about this big and it kind of looks like an abalone, but what's really cool about it is it's a muricid gastropod. So it's actually a predator. It's a carnivore, and it eats mussels. So it's not a herbivore like our abalone, are herbivores and eat kelp. They actually eat mussels. And quite strikingly, before the reserve, there were none of these guys because humans came and took them all. After they set up the reserve in 4 years, there were enough of these that had recruited back to the system that they reduced the cover of those mussels tremendously. So another example of this trophic effect. So I'm going to just talk for a couple minutes about networks of reserves. And this is the idea of how do you put many different little pieces of the puzzle together so that they function in a holistic way, so that you can get this spilling over of larvae outside the reserve and serving to seed populations, maybe in other reserves or maybe in fished areas to enhance those fisheries. And so this idea was explored heavily in the Channel Islands, and this is a great example, I think, of one of the best networks of marine protected areas in the world, literally. So much thought went into this, and there was a lot of compromise, but in the end, the idea was that it should be encompassing a variety of different habitats and bioregions. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but how big should they be? So how do you know how large to make an MPA? And that depends on a few things. It depends on the distances of dispersal, and here are just relative scales of dispersal for a lot of different organisms. So when I ask the question, how big should you make it, it really depends on what species you're interested in. Obviously, the bigger you make it, the more species you're going to protect, but that's where these compromises come in. It also depends on movement patterns, and so here are data showing you 3 different species of fish that this is the amount of time that they spent inside that Anacapa Island Marine Reserve in the red and outside in the blue. Whereas if you look at something that's kind of a wide-ranging species like the giant sea bass, this is really interesting that about 25% of the detections of that species were actually in MPAs around the Channel Islands. Okay, I talked about habitat. These, generally speaking, are some of the predominant important habitat types that people really wanted to protect in this process of setting up marine protected areas. So rocky intertidal, shallow reefs, deep rocky reefs, because that's a whole different assemblages, sandy habitats, and then also sandy beaches. And many of you in Southern California may not think of sandy beaches as an ecosystem, but they indeed are an ecosystem, and a very important one. Okay, bioregional representation, that's really important, especially in the Channel Islands, which is why the Channel Islands process was very complex, because the Channel Islands span a huge gradient in bioregions. So from the very cold waters of San Miguel down to like these really warm waters off of Catalina. And so this was yet another factor that fed into that process of network design. We already talked a little bit about size guidelines, but these are just some of the general rules of thumb that emerged from that process. What I'd really like to talk a little bit more about now is how do we know if they are working? Okay, so monitoring is the way we assess if they're working, and monitoring is basically going out there and counting the organisms inside and outside marine reserves and trying to get a handle on what's happening, how that reserve is working. So these are just some of the patterns we might expect to see when monitoring MPAs. So here you might have a state marine reserve with no fishing inside. You might have another site outside, so this is kind of a classic inside-outside comparison. And these are the kinds of data you might expect to see. So this is when the MPA goes into effect right here. Their numbers of fish are about the same until that happens, and then in the area where there's no fishing, the number of fish goes way up, and then maybe due to those fishermen redistributing themselves more heavily in those areas outside the MPA, you might actually see a decline outside the MPA. And there are a variety of different hypotheses you can have about how that MPA works in terms of these population changes. So here's an example, the first one, which shows that there might be actually spillover effects. So that MPA, the fish might go up inside the MPA, but they might also go up outside the MPA due to spillover from that marine protected area. You also might see a scenario where they both go down. And that might be indicative of the fact that something external to removing fishing pressure, like climate change, pollution, whatever is happening, and it's just hitting the MPA and the control area equally, and everything is just kind of going downhill altogether. This is kind of a classic pattern that we see, is that the MPA is established, and there's a certain time lag that happens before you see any changes. So everything is still kind of not different from one another, and then all of a sudden, boom, those reproductively mature it takes a while for those reproductively mature or individuals in the MPA to grow to a size where they're reproductively mature, reproduce, and those fish to get larger. And then another pattern we see quite often too is no change. And this could be no change for a variety of reasons. It could be the fact that there just might not be a lot of fishing outside that MPA. So both those populations are not really changing very much. And here are the two major effects we expect to see on the populations. So if we go from an unfished population to a fished population, and we talked about this earlier, the first thing you might tend to see are the large individuals getting taken out. So that's a truncated distribution. We also would tend to see the fact that the numbers of individuals overall are going down. Now, if you do the opposite, and you take a heavily fished area and you protect it, so you make it a reserve, hopefully you might see the opposite. You might see those large individuals coming back, and you might see overall more fish coming into the system. And all of that can also depend on what we call larval recruitment. So how many of those larvae are coming from outside the MPA back into the MPA? That would be an open population. And then how many are coming from within the MPA? That's a closed population. So I'm going to move into the case studies here from the Channel Islands. And again, as we pointed out, in April 2003 is when these MPAs were actually implemented in the Channel Islands. And in 2007, these MPAs were actually extended even further offshore into federal waters. So the 2003, that's 10 years ago. We're coming on 10 years of data in this system. So what do we know? First of all, the first thing we have to deal with when thinking about all the data from the Channel Islands is that the fact that there's this huge environmental gradient. So from some of the very cold waters of San Miguel to the warmest waters of Anacapa. And this temperature variation can influence a lot how fast individuals grow and where and how abundant they are. And here are generally some of the biogeographic patterns on the kelp forest systems of the Channel Islands that probably many of you are familiar with, but in the cold waters of the West Islands, you tend to see cool sea stars like Pycnopodia, the giant sunflower star, things like lingcod, cold water rockfishes like the China rockfish. And then as you move towards the east, you tend to see things like the worm water, the Garibaldi, the kelp bass, and then of course our friend the lobster. Okay, so first of all, what's going on with the fish? And these data are relatively hot off the press. So this is from just a couple years ago. And these are data from one of the largest sampling programs out there, the PISCO research group, who I actually work with, where we actually have study sites all over the Channel Islands. And fish surveys are done as well as benthic surveys, so invertebrates and fish. And the first thing to look at with these data was, well, given that environmental gradient from the coldest to the warmest, how do these communities differ? And you can see here, this is a way of representing those data in two-dimensional space where Sites that are more similar to one another are closer. So the way to read this is San Miguel is in blue. All the San Miguel sites are close to one another. Santa Barbara Island is in red. They're all close to one another. And they're sort of the extremes. And then everything else that are sort of these middle islands, Santa Cruz and Santa Rosa, they're a little bit more differentiated, but they're closer to one another. So that indicates to us that certainly biogeography is an overwhelmingly important variable in the system, which is no surprise to anyone. However, given those biogeographic differences across the island, does density, size structure, and biomass differ inside and outside of those MPAs? Okay, and so first I'm going to just show you some of the data, and this is from a paper by Scott Hamilton, looking at the densities of fish inside and outside reserves. So basically the way to look at this is that any of the points that are on the left side of this line have a higher abundance outside the reserve. Any of the points that are to the right of this line have a higher abundance inside the reserve. And then the species that tend to be targeted by fishing pressure are in orange, and those non-targeted tend to be in blue. So indeed, more of the species that tended to be targeted by fishing were more abundant inside the reserves. Very few of those targeted species were, some of them were sort of neutral, but almost none of them had higher abundance outside the reserves. Whereas you see sort of the opposite pattern for the non-targeted species, which you might expect. How about biomass? Well, we do see the same sort of pattern with biomass. So if you look at the targeted species, have a much larger biomass inside the reserve than outside the reserve. And then the non-targeted species show a slight difference, but it's non-significant. And again, you can see those patterns playing out in these graphs below for each of the individual islands. Okay, so this issue of food web structure, are there any of these sort of trophic interactions that are apparent? So if we take the data and we look at different trophic groups, so think fish that tend to be herbivores and eat algae, things that are planktivores eat things like zooplankton, carnivores tend to eat like sheephead, eat urchins and invertebrates, and then piscivores are those fish that eat other fish. So this is sort of going up the trophic chain from the sort of lower to the higher levels. What we tend to see is that the biomass of the piscivores and the carnivores seem to show the strongest response to reserve protection, and that is indeed because those are the species that tend to be more targeted by the fishing pressure. Okay, so that's fish. What's going on with the lobster? And I think the lobster are a really interesting story in this system because they've shown really strong responses. And so this is from a paper that just came out last year from Matt Kay, and there's a group called Cal Lobster that's doing a collaborative fisheries program with the lobster fishermen out at the Channel Islands. And they looked at a variety of different marine protected areas around the Channel Islands, and they compared the patterns they were seeing outside to inside the MPAs. And quite simply, they saw the highest densities of lobsters inside the reserve. So if you look at the data before the MPAs were implemented, these are the data in the black. There's no difference inside and outside the MPAs, which don't even exist yet, so that makes a lot of sense. But once the MPAs are implemented, boom, you have much higher densities of lobsters inside those MPAs, and there's no difference in the areas outside. They also looked at locations that were inside the MPAs compared to those that were very near to the MPAs and very far from the MPAs. And I can't remember exactly what distances they called near and far, but they saw, generally speaking, no effect of that distance. They also tagged lobsters to just look at how far they moved. And so this shows you the numbers of lobsters that they tagged in the reserve that they actually recaptured in the reserve. So most of the lobsters that they tagged in the reserve, they got back in the reserve. They got a few of them in the areas that were close to the reserve and hardly any that were far away. The same pattern holds true for those that they tagged close to the reserve. That's kind of where they found them. They found a few in and a few further away. And then those that they tagged in areas that were far away from the reserve, that's generally where they tended to find them. So most lobsters don't move far, but a few lobsters do move far, is the message. I don't know how it was set up. That's an interesting question. I think so. There must have been something on the tag. You can look at Matt Kay's paper. I can give you the reference for that. I'm sure he talks about that. But they were actually working with almost all the lobster fishermen out there. So I think all the lobster fishermen out there were very cognizant of their study and were actually working with them, which was nice. And so if you look at size, which is something we've seen in other studies too, if you look at sizes from the fishery, and of course what you tend to see is that, as we hope, they are truncated at a certain point because they can't take individuals that are smaller than a certain size. But this tends to be the size distribution that they are catching in the fishery, which reflects the size distributions that if you remove these individuals that are uncatchable because they're too small, really reflects well the size distribution that you see outside the MPAs, either near or far. But however, once you look at inside the MPAs, you tend to see a lot more of these large individuals occurring inside the MPAs. And one of the messages from this paper, too, is, there's this issue of, well, is there spillover? So are these large lobsters, these mini lobsters that are being found inside the MPAs, are they enhancing the fishery just immediately outside the MPA through this spillover mechanism? And while their data don't really support or reject that, I think their general conclusion is, well, there's not really any great evidence for that, but they're also not saying that it's not happening. There's just not enough information yet for them to really evaluate that question. Okay, finally, I just wanted to end up talking about the South Coast region as a whole, because now those Channel Islands MPAs are part of this entire region. So here is the whole picture, the statewide picture of all the MPAs along the California coast. And just to recap, this region, South Coast region, went into effect in January 2012. The South Coast MPA baseline monitoring program was established at that time. And the monitoring program really is to provide a snapshot of those ecological and socioeconomic conditions that exist at or near the time of implementation, as well as trying to measure any key changes that could be happening in that those first 2 or 3 years. Here is just a brief map of all those MPAs in the South Coast region. Here, and you can see all these, I'll talk about this in a minute, ocean spaces, but here's just the titles of all of those baseline projects that are ongoing now as we speak in the South Coast region, including the Channel Islands. And I alluded to this before, but oceanspaces.org, just so you all know, this is now the place. It's a website that you can go to, and it is, has been created by the California Ocean Science Trust and the Marine Monitoring Enterprise to house all of the data that are being collected in MPAs, all the information about MPAs, all the baseline monitoring programs, project, and it's really what they hope for it to be is this online community that brings people together to learn a lot more about the oceans, to look at data, to explore data, to interact with the scientists, you name it. So it's really cool, and it's really easy to remember, oceanspaces.org, but that's really the place to go if you want to find out anything about MPAs in the state of California. You can explore maps, so they have some really nice interfaces that show the whole region. You can drill down on specific areas, see who's doing what where, and you can actually explore some of the trends. At this point in the South Coast region, there aren't a lot of data up there yet because these programs just have begun. But if you go to Ocean Spaces, you can also hit Central Coast or North Central. And Central Coast, I just came back last week, 2 weeks ago, from the Central Coast MPA Symposium, and they've just finished 5 years of having those reserves in effect. And so all of the data from the Central Coast are now up on Ocean Spaces to explore. And again, it just gives you a lot more information about ongoing projects as well as people doing that sort of research. And I just wanted to end there and take any questions you might have.
Hi, I've been using the information from that, I guess it was the 2009 study for a couple of years to tell people about how wonderful the MPAs work. Is there any update on that study particularly?
Which 2009
Okay,
study?
the ones around the Channel Islands started in 2003, and that graph that you showed that had the 400% increase in biomass and the 23% diversity, 21% size of the fish.
Yeah.
Has that anything been done with that one? Because I was curious to see if there was a follow-up to that.
Right. Given that it's a great question actually. Given this is 2013, this is sort of the 10-year anniversary of those MPAs. At the 5-year point, there was a large public symposium and a big event highlighting the first 5 years of monitoring in the Channel Islands. And I know that sort of ongoing discussion right now about, well, is there going to be a 10-year event? And now that these MPAs have been rolled into the South Coast region and sort of it's a little bit of a different beast at this point, so I don't know where that process is at. But what I can say is that those two studies that I talked about at the end there, one was from 2012, the Lobster study, and then the study on the fish communities was from 2010. That was Scott Hamilton. Those are probably the most recent data that are out there at this point. There are data that researchers sort of have in their hands and they're analyzing, but I don't think they've kind of hit the press yet. But what I do know from working with those people and seeing the data is those trends are sort of continuing. So, I mean, the story hasn't changed. Yeah.
Right over there.
Oh, sorry.
Can you explain the relationship between the state MPAs and the national NOAA, National Marine Sanctuaries, how they work together and do enforcement and protection?
I can do my best. I'm not really an expert in this area, but what I do know is certainly the Channel Islands being an example. The Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary was a key player in getting the MPAs here in the Channel Islands up and running. So they were a key partner with California Department of Fish and Game. They don't do enforcement. They are, a federal agency, and they're sort of tasked with a whole variety of different things related to outreach and maritime heritage, lots of stuff like that. Cal Fish and Game, which is now California Fish and Wildlife, for those of you who don't know, they changed their name as of January 1st. Still the same agency, just a new name. But they are the ones who are responsible for enforcement statewide. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess some of our oldest MPAs by accident would be the military ones like Cape Canaveral. And
yes.
So how much cooperation are we getting? Is the military, the Navy giving us access to really look into these oldest ones that really exist?
That's a great question. And I don't know that much about Cape Canaveral. That's an example that's always used as a place that has tremendous fish sizes and densities and biodiversity because of that. But if you do know much about the South Coast region on that map that I showed you that showed all the different MPAs of the South Coast, you would notice that San Clemente Island, which is largely military, well, entirely military, there are two areas off of San Clemente that are not MPAs per se. They're not part of the statewide process, but they're military exclusion zones, which means not only can you not fish in them, you just can't go in them. I mean, you don't want to go in them because you don't want to be shot at. But because they are very interested in, the military is very interested in this process and being part of the process, we now have been working with them in the last couple of years to go and do these same surveys out at San Clemente. So next week, we will be out at San Clemente and we'll be in the military exclusion zones doing these kinds of surveys. So it'll be, I think, really fascinating to see what kinds of patterns are going to emerge from comparing sort of these very different kinds of marine protected areas out there.
On one of your first slides, you showed a map of the world, and there were a couple of areas that were in red.
Yeah.
It looked like it was around England and around Japan. And then a follow-up slide showed where all the MPAs are around the world.
Yeah.
Those red areas, is there no MPAs there because of will or politics, or why aren't there MPAs where those red areas are?
You mean the red areas that are the highest impact?
Yes.
Areas? There are MPAs in those areas. I would say that sort of the world leader in MPAs in terms of regions of the world are Australia, the Great Barrier Reef. South Africa has a wonderful system of marine protected areas. Europe has marine protected areas. The problem with Europe is just that the impact is sort of everywhere, and they can't have marine protected areas everywhere. So they do have them. They're just, and those impacts aren't just fishing impacts. Those are cumulative impacts based on things like ocean acidification, pollution, the whole gamut. So again, marine protected areas will sort of help in some areas, but aren't going to really be that effective against ocean acidification, for example. But yeah.
Early in your presentation, you had on your slide postage stamp and paper, unquote.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit historically on those?
Yeah, so historically, so here's what I know, or the way I understand that, is that that period from 1950 to 1999, when these 50 MPAs existed in the state of California, like I said, they're very idiosyncratic. Postage stamp meaning they're very small, so really tiny. So like, well, we're going to just have an MPA in front of my house, and that's going to be the MPA. Or paper park MPAs, meaning they weren't enforced. So they were designated as an MPA on paper, but everybody who was a fisherman and went out there just did whatever they did. So that's kind of what those meant. And it wasn't and that's why, even though there were 50 MPAs, it wasn't a very effective tool at all. Yeah.
I just wanted to add to how the national park law enforcement officers on Marine Patrol, they're the ones that you'll see out at the islands enforcing the marine protected areas.
Yeah.
You don't really see the swordfish out there. They haven't had funding, I guess, for years. We saw them out there a little bit last year and the year before, but we rarely see them out doing protection. So it's the National Park Service that is the one that's really helping control the MPA areas and making sure people are educated and not fishing there because they think it's okay.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And I think given the extensive spread of MPAs, it's really hard, given the funding situation for, let's say, Cal Fish and Game, to do adequate enforcement. So they rely on a lot of eyes. And if there's a phone number that you can look up on their website also called CalTIP. So if you are somebody that happens to be out and you see an activity happening in an MPA that should not be happening, they have phone numbers that you can call as well. Cal Fish and Game's website. Look up CalTIP in Google. Yeah. I used to have some stickers, but I didn't bring those.
You talked about the lobsters, and my understanding is that the lobster larvae go a long ways through the ocean currents. So how is there any correlation between MPAs and lobster recruitment?
That's a great question because, and you're very right. Lobsters have one of the longest pelagic larval durations, almost a year. They are out, and we don't really know where they go. We don't know very much about lobster because they're very difficult to, it's very difficult to track larvae and figure out where they are and what they're doing. And I think that's a really active area of research. So you noticed in the studies with the lobster that one thing that you might expect is that if you're protecting this one particular area and you're getting a lot of large reproductive lobsters in there, you might not expect the area just immediately outside of that MPA to have a lot of benefit if those lobsters are going, you know, down to Baja or somewhere else entirely. And I think that's part of the the analysis that they did in that paper looking at spillover, it was just too difficult to really look at that question, partially due to exactly that point.
You know, I was in a study that we saw at the symposium or somewhere that's where the kelp comes in, I think, with these larva dispersals from however, from Baja, whatever, the larvae are going to be protected by the kelp wherever they go.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the answer. And the other thing with relation to kelp, I think, can we pass this on that I've read, is more oxygen gets into the air from our plants in the ocean than it does from all our rainforests.
Kelps and seagrass as well, surf grass. So lobsters, if you ever go out lobster diving, I mean, like kelps are great, but they also love, and one thought is that the larvae, the very young lobsters, start out settling very close to shore in that surf grass and then sort of make their movements a little bit further offshore as well. So not just the kelp, but that whole sort of surf grass, macroalgal community habitat is super important.
I have one more question, and that's the first graphs that you showed how the fish plummeted. I mean plummeted between 1960 and 1980. Is that because, I don't know, people started eating more fish, there was more refrigeration, or, I mean, why did it plummet so much and so rapidly?
Right, that's a great question. That's such a global picture of all the fisheries around the world. So obviously there are lots of different issues there. In terms of how those fisheries are regulated, they're regulated very differently in different countries around the world. And certainly those are the example fisheries that have plummeted. There are others that didn't plummet. But I think between that period, I mean, just our technology, our ability to catch fish has improved greatly. That would be my hypothesis, but I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Can you speak a little bit about the abalone population in and out?
Good question. The abalone population. There have been, somebody in this room probably knows more about it than I do, but here's what I do know is that there have been thoughts and there have been efforts to go out and survey the abalone. We're talking about red abalone. Well, I can talk about black abalone and red abalone, two different stories. Red abalone, which is sort of a large part of the fishery, abalone fishery here traditionally, they're not extinct. They're not super abundant, but they're quite abundant at San Miguel. The colder islands tend to be abundant. And there's been thought and talk of potentially reopening that fishery, especially out at places like San Miguel. And I don't know that much about it. I'm not sure where that issue lies right now, and I know several of you in this room probably know more about it than I do. But black abalone, which I'll go to next, black abalone was listed as an endangered species in 5 years ago, 6 years ago, something like that. And many people I know who really study black abalone thought, you know, it got hit by the wasting disease, which happened right after the 82, 83 El Nino. So the period of the late 80s, they really went downhill. And it's a bacterial infection in these abalone that just causes them to wither up and die. That disease has actually progressed northward over time. And so now we're seeing declines of abalone sort of up the coast as well. However, that being said, people who know black abalone thought, well, gosh, they got wiped out at the islands. They are not going to come back, because with abalone, it requires a certain closeness of individuals to effectively reproduce when you think about how they release their gametes into the water. So getting those gametes to fertilize one another, they need to be relatively close. And then the few abalone that were left were sort of like scattered around. They weren't all that close. People thought, nah, no way, they're never coming back. But they are coming back. And so if there's a study right now from San Nicolas Island, they're seeing a lot of recruitment of black abalone. We do research on Santa Cruz Island, and with actually Dan Richards, who just retired from the park. But he was really involved in looking at black abalone coming back. They're coming back on Anacapa, they're coming back on Santa Cruz. We're seeing small individuals. We don't know where they're coming from or why they're coming back, but they're coming back. So I don't know what the future of black abalone is going to look like, but I'm really surprised and encouraged by that.
But this is outside of nothing to do with the marine protected area.
Nothing to do with the marine protected areas, because black abalone are an endangered species. So even if there weren't marine protected areas, they would be off limits no matter what. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to hold the questions right there. And if you do have a question, Carol will stick around. You can come up and ask.
Sure,
But we're going to give people a chance to leave if they want to go. And it's been very interesting. Let's give Carol a hand of applause.